Now to a media storm about the Prime Minister's spring conference speech over the weekend. Yesterday, the Chancellor said he did not think the fight against Russia and the vote against the EU were analogous, and neither did the Prime Minister. Neither did the Prime Minister. But The Guardian and the BBC, and just about everyone else in the media, have just asserted as fact that Boris Johnson directly compared Ukrainians fighting Putin with Brits voting for Brexit in 2016. Didn't he? Well, perhaps now it's time to look at what the Prime Minister actually said, not what was just reported. In a section about Ukraine's love of freedom, Boris Johnson spoke about a free press, markets and democratic elections. Yes, not taking up arms against an aggressor, as the media implied, but rather the love of and journey to free institutions. Let's take a listen.
Entirely different reason. He was frightened of Ukraine because in Ukraine they have a free press, and in Ukraine they have free elections. And with every year that Ukraine progressed, not always easily, towards freedom and democracy and open markets, he feared the Ukrainian example, and he feared the implicit reproach to himself. Because in Putin's Russia, you get jailed for 15 years just for calling an invasion an invasion. And if you stand against Putin in an election, you get poisoned or shot. And that is why Putin must fail. And I know that it's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. I can give you a couple of famous recent examples. When the British people voted for Brexit in such large numbers, I don't believe it was because they were remotely hostile to foreigners. It's because they wanted to be free.
It doesn't sound quite as it was reported now, does it? The examples of the Ukrainian instinct for freedom the Prime Minister had just given were of democratic processes, not of war, as just about every journalist has claimed since. This is how the BBC's Sophie Rayworth described it yesterday.
The Prime Minister said yesterday in Blackpool the comparison that he made between Ukrainians fighting Russians like British voting for Brexit.
Fighting Russians? How did free elections turn into fighting Russians? I think perhaps the BBC was reading too much of The Guardian's front page, which reported, quote, "Fury greets the PM's claim that Ukraine fight is like Brexit." But was that the claim? The Guardian newspaper did not seem all that sure when it first reported it half a day earlier. This was their report, that Boris Johnson only, quote, appears to liken Ukrainians' fight to Brexit. Appears to. An interpretation, not a fact. Yet the fact that a Twitter storm ensued with people who did not watch the full speech, which was attended and applauded by the Ukrainian ambassador, by the way, it was those people who have asserted one particular misinterpretation as the gospel truth. But there's more. Not only was the Prime Minister talking about Ukrainians' free institutions, not their fight, he made more comparisons too. Another part of the speech chopped off by broadcasters and Twitter users was the Prime Minister's very next sentence. Saying another example of Brits' love of freedom was the fact that we voluntarily got vaccinated in such large numbers.
Give you another example, where the British population came forward to be vaccinated at such incredible speed, voluntarily, unlike many other countries. I'm sure it was, of course, partly because they wanted to avoid catching COVID. But I'll tell you why people did it. Why did the British people come forward? I mean, 90% we got, entirely voluntarily. Entirely voluntarily. It was because they wanted to get on with their lives. They were fed up with being told what to do.
He was about to say, by people like me. Now, an unscrupulous journalist could claim in exactly the same way as many did vis-à-vis Brexit, that Boris Johnson just disgracefully compared the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to Vladimir Putin. After all, he said that the Ukrainian instinct for freedom was like Brits going to get vaccinated, quote, because they were fed up of being told what to do by people like me. If the Prime Minister had really directly compared Ukraine's fight with the Brexit vote, as was reported, then he also, in the next breath, compared himself and the actions of his government, i.e. telling people what to do, with the actions of Mr. Putin. Now, clearly that's absurd. Clearly no one at the conference saw it that way. Clearly the Ukrainian ambassador in the front row did not see it that way. And yet so much of the media, most of whom weren't actually there, by the way, so much of the media reported not on the speech, but on the manufactured and misleading Twitter content instead. And now the narrative is set. It is received wisdom that Boris said fighting Russia was like voting against the EU. All that despite it not being true. What was true, however, as a little addendum, was the fact that so many leading Remain campaigners compared Brexiteers to Nazis. Not least of all Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who, far from doing so sheepishly, he doubled down on the claim, telling the BBC's flagship MAR programme that the comparison, quote, wasn't strong enough. But whataboutery is never particularly edifying, no matter how illuminating it may be. No, the remarkable point in this story isn't to say they're all as bad as each other, because in this case, they're not. The issue here is to ask how one absurd interpretation of a line in a speech has come to become the accepted truth in the eyes of so much of the media. How paraphrasing and context chopping has rewritten history. And that's something we should all be concerned by.